Russia's invasion of Ukraine has reached a critical breaking point. Once hailed as a swift operation, it has unraveled into a 2-year crisis marked by internal strife and military setbacks. With Ukraine ramping up its counterattacks and even advancing into Kursk, the situation for Russia grows more dire. Join us as we delve into how these developments are igniting discontent among Russian ranks and shaping the future of this conflict. The consequences of conscription and poor defense. The Kursk invasion marked a turning point in the war, shifting the balance of power between Russia and Ukraine. For 30 months, Russia aggressively invaded Ukraine, but the conflict escalated further when Ukrainian forces crossed the border into Russia's poorly defended Kursk province. Initially, Russian reports downplayed the invasion, claiming that only about 100 Ukrainian soldiers crossed the border. However, as the Ukrainian forces captured villages and towns, it became clear that the invasion was progressing, largely due to the use of Russian conscripts in Kursk's defense. The invasion exposed the weaknesses in Russia's military structure as conscripts, not professional soldiers, were sent to defend Kursk. Around 80% of the Russian forces in Kursk were conscripts, and many of them surrendered to Ukrainian troops. The invasion highlighted the flaws in Russia's recruitment system, which increasingly relied on conscripts instead of well-trained contract soldiers. The Russian military's two-pronged enlistment system includes contract soldiers who serve for 3 years and conscripts who are drafted for 1-year terms. While contract soldiers are better paid and trained, conscripts receive far less training and are mostly used for non-combat roles. The war has forced Russia to rely heavily on conscripts, especially after increasing the conscription age limit to 30 in 2023. The demographic imbalance in the Russian military has led to a situation where conscripts, mostly from rural areas, are deployed in combat zones with minimal preparation. This shift to conscripts has compounded Russia's military challenges, as these soldiers are often seen as a last resort and not combat-ready, with their primary role being support functions rather than frontline defense. This issue is exacerbated by a legal restriction that prevents conscripts from being deployed abroad, further limiting their effectiveness in the ongoing conflict. Russia's military structure and the role of conscripts. But that all changed with the Kursk invasion. Suddenly, Ukraine became the attacker on Russian soil, and the conscripts were thrust into the heat of battle, as unprepared and under-equipped as they ever were. With all the previous points in mind, it's quite clear to see exactly why there has been a wave of surrenders in Kursk and why the Russian military has failed to mount a significant defense in the region. With the floodgates to Russian territory open, Putin now has all the means and motive to send conscripts to defend Russia, and that's a particularly dangerous precedent considering what happened to conscripts in previous campaigns. For that, we'll need to go back further into history, when the Soviet Union still existed. During Soviet times, the Russian army had several million conscripted soldiers, making it one of the largest conscripted armies in the world. The impact of past conflicts on conscripts. Unlike today, these conscripts could be readily mobilized for any conflict. They ended up being deployed to fight in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. Known as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, the war ended up being one of the final nails in the coffin for the Soviet Union, but not without significant casualties. By the time the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan, it was estimated to have lost 15,000 soldiers. While this number is small compared to the overall impact of the current war, the losses among these mostly conscripted soldiers sparked significant discontent with the Soviet regime and public institutions. The soldiers who survived the war were quickly forgotten amid the sweeping changes brought on by the fall of the Soviet Union and sought to extend their military careers elsewhere. When Putin came to power, the Afghan veterans were brought back into the fold and awarded for their bravery and contribution to the country. Those same veterans became fervent supporters of Putin's regime and perhaps a part of the reason the military was so ready to conduct offensive operations abroad. But for the average conscript, life would only get worse. current challenges, and the oligarchs' influence. After the First Chechen War in the 1990s, Russia experienced significant losses, with over 1,000 soldiers killed in a civil conflict that claimed up to 130,000 civilian lives and displaced 500,000. This war led to widespread protests against the regime, causing public opinion on conscripts to plummet. In response, Russia adopted a statute banning the deployment of conscripts overseas, though conscription remained mandatory. By the time the Russo-Ukrainian War escalated, many Russians were actively trying to avoid military service, with up to $900,000 fleeing the country by 2022. Conscripts were often unprepared, with many having little training or equipment to defend themselves. Reports from the Kursk invasion revealed that most conscripts were ill-prepared for battle, leading to quick surrenders. Many conscripts only had a week of training before being deployed. Russia's military largely prioritizes contract soldiers, offering higher pay and more extensive training. However, the war has forced an increased reliance on conscripts, many of whom may not even complete their first year of service due to the ongoing conflict. The Kursk invasion highlighted the weak state of Russia's defense, as conscripts with limited preparation were quickly overwhelmed by more experienced Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, in Moscow, powerful oligarchs who had traditionally supported Putin began to oppose the war, with some publicly criticizing the conflict. This shift in loyalty poses a challenge to Putin, whose reliance on the oligarchs has been key to his economic control. In summary, the Kursk invasion and the increasing discontent among conscripts and oligarchs illustrate the growing instability within Russia, both on the battlefield and domestically. The struggles of Russia's oligarchs and the energy crisis. The current case to nationalize Andrei Melnichenko's company is an example. Many enterprises owned by oligarchs like Melnichenko have lost economic links because of Western sanctions. Because of this, the Russian authorities can easily control them and their owners. The oligarchs may also be involved. We mentioned that many of them got rich in energy. That sector isn't doing well. Ukraine's repeated refinery strikes have caused major oil and gas shortages. Because Russia uses just-in-time delivery, it keeps little oil in reserve while being one of the world's greatest producers. An abrupt decline in production, like a Russian refinery being bombed, can impede the supply of these important resources. The internal economy and trade are affected. After losing roughly 15% of its oil refining capacity last year, Russia stopped exporting fuel to all but 4 former Soviet countries until 2024, with some analysts predicting a 2025 embargo. Russia has also urged Kazakhstan to store 100,000 tons of fuel for emergency supply. But that doesn't mean Russian oligarchs lost anything in the battle. Bloomberg listed a dozen enterprises that earned more than $11 billion in dividends in 2023, so the oligarchs still got money, even if it came from different sources. However, Putin's attempts to demolish some of the biggest earners and Ukrainian attacks on the oil and gas trade set a dangerous precedent for industry oligarchs. Trade deal cancellations and export bans will cause long-term deficits because the energy industry accounts for 20% of GDP. Western sanctions reduce oligarch coverage under Putin. Putin may find the old stock of oligarchs worthless in sustaining the pretense of universal support if sanctions cut their links. To make matters worse for Putin, Ukraine has escalated its onslaught, alienating oligarchs and the middle class. Ukraine's rising offensive and the impact on Putin's leadership. Ukraine launched its largest drone strike on September 10, 2024. Over 140 drones struck deep into Russia. The second drone attack follows the August 21st strike. Main goal, actual Moscow. The August strike was stopped by Russian anti-air systems, while the September hit damaged dozens of city center homes and killed people. 50 Moscow aircraft were diverted by the mayhem. This is Ukraine's first attack against Moscow and may be a sign of more. Ukraine has warned Putin of drone strikes. Russia is unsafe. Moscow populations, untainted by the war, may feel profoundly about the strikes. Along with Ukraine gaining more Russian land in a month than Russia's offensive in the preceding 7, the attacks created a hazardous precedent for Putin. The Kremlin may no longer be able to hide military facts. If conscription troubles persist, Russia may need to use a resource it hasn't used in a while: big city middle and upper classes. Interestingly, this targets Russian oligarchs again. Wealthy Russians could observe and profit from the action, but they are now in trouble. Their firms could be confiscated by the government, export limits are squeezing their cash flows, and their offspring may have to fight for Putin's shaky rule. Even Russia's younger elite is suffering. The energy sector's long-term growth has forced other sectors to fall behind. China has taken over and created near monopolies for cell phones, vehicles, and agricultural equipment. With home manufacturing under attack, staying in business is pointless if foreign goods are cheaper. Putin is headed for a confrontation with those who have supported his political monopoly. If he acts aggressively, the oligarchs may be desperate enough to remove him forever. Putin is about to lose support from most Russians who can directly affect the Ukraine war. If one of those dominoes falls, Putin may have to escalate the Ukraine war to end it. Russia can outlive Ukraine in an attrition war on paper. Even though Ukraine has lost roughly 500,000 soldiers in the previous 30 months, Russia has doubled the number of people to throw at the meat grinder. Ukraine's entry into Russia has reinvigorated Western support, with the U.S. announcing further help before year's end. Despite long-standing saber-rattling, Russia has not deployed nuclear weapons against NATO. Encourage the alliance to supply Ukraine with more advanced military equipment, some of which were prevented by nuclear threats. As the first batch of 65 F-16 fighter jets soars above Ukraine, the balance of power continues to shift. Zelensky now has a stronger hand, and with pressure mounting, the end of this conflict seems closer than ever. But will Putin make a decisive move, or will the circumstances dictate his fate? The future remains uncertain, and your thoughts could be just as critical in shaping the narrative. Share your opinions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more updates. Thank you for watching.